Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar about tackling allergies and asthma in your facility. I'm Ann Cosgrove, the Editor-in-Chief of Facility Executive Magazine, and this webinar today is presented by AeraMax Professional. Before we get started, I would like to cover a few housekeeping items with you. Please note the control panel on your screen. This is where you can submit questions in the question box in that panel. Please send your questions in at any time for the speaker during the presentation, and he will address them after the presentation. We'll also have a question and answer session at that time, so we can go over the questions and address your concerns or questions. So please note the orange arrow on the left side of your panel. Clicking on that arrow will either expand or collapse the panel, so please be sure it is expanded so you can access the question box. Also, you can use that space if at any time you do experience a technical difficulty. You can send us a message there and someone will address it right away with you directly. Furthermore, if you'd like to receive a copy of the presentation from today, please also send us a request via that question section, and we will put you in touch with the speaker after this event. So now I'd like to introduce your speaker today. He's Mike Booth, and Mike is the Senior Marketing Manager with AeraMax Professional. He has spent the last 3 years evangelizing the need to focus on indoor air quality and the impact it can have on people's health and well-being. He's a 7-year veteran at the company, and he's worked in various marketing capacities with a focus on productivity and health in commercial environments. So we look forward to hearing from him today. With that, I will hand it over to Mike. Hi, Mike.
Hi, and thank you very much. And thanks, everyone, for joining today's webinar. As we've heard, this is all about the topic of tackling allergies and asthma within your facility. And we're really going to be diving into the topic of not just cleaning, but cleaning with a focus on generating a health benefit for the occupant or user of your particular facility. So with that being said, let's dive straight into things. There's a lot of content for us to get through. So we're going to move through this at pace, but please do use the Q&A panel as a way of asking any questions or asking for further information on any topic that we do touch on today. So 3 primary learning objectives. First of all, we're going to really just look at the impact of allergies and asthma on humans, on people that are going to be using your facility or maybe employees within a commercial environment. Then secondly, really diving into this topic of cleaning for health. What approaches can we use as a way of removing some of these triggers, specifically thinking about inhalable triggers, really things that are affecting people from a respiratory perspective. And then finally, really looking at some simple approaches as a way of reducing some of these contaminants from facilities and ultimately trying to make an immediate and sustained positive impact. The primary focus is allergy and asthma, but we are going to cover, especially given a lot of the news coverage right now on influenza, we are going to touch on some of the other drivers of what can make indoor air quality go bad towards the end of the webinar today. So I just wanted to flag that. We're going to touch on another couple of topics as well. So diving into this first subject matter, I think it's always useful for us to be on the same page. These seem like obvious terms. I think we're all familiar and have our own definitions of what we mean by allergies and asthma, but we just like to really ground right at the start of the webinar and cover simple definitions of these 2 terms. So first of all, an allergy, really it's defined as an abnormal reaction of the body to a previously encountered allergen that's introduced by inhalation, ingestion, injection, or skin contact. And there are a number of symptoms that are led to through some form of allergic reaction. So simply put, it's typically an overreaction or a hypersensitive reaction to something that is typically seen as harmless in a normal circumstance. And then asthma, this is really a chronic lung disorder that is marked by recurring episodes of airway obstruction, manifested by labored breathing, accompanied especially by wheezing and coughing, and by a sense of constriction in the chest. And then similarly triggered by a hyperreaction to multiple stimuli. So there's often a crossover between these 2 terms, especially when it comes to respiratory allergies. Often they come hand in hand. Asthmatics will suffer from certain respiratory allergies at the same time. So really just want to frame up those 2 definitions. And then let's just think about the reach of these particular issues to people in the United States today. So around 20% of the US population suffers from some form of an allergy. So that's 1 in 5 people, whether you're dialed in today from a perspective of an education environment, a corporate office environment, or maybe just a public space, that's 1 in 5 people who use your facility, who are an occupant of your facility, who are suffering in some way, shape, or form from an allergy. And then from an asthmatic perspective, around 1 in 10 children nowadays in the United States suffer from asthma. And not only is that number quite scary, 10% of children, but that's a growing concern within children as far as asthma sufferers is concerned. We see a significant trend and increase in the amount of children who are suffering from asthmatic conditions. And because of the impact that air can have, especially on asthma, but also when it comes to respiratory allergies, it comes as no surprise that this is becoming a growing concern as we think about some of the ways that we're evolving and some of the generational changes that we see, especially as we look towards the younger generations. So typically nowadays, especially in the United States, we're spending around 90% of our time indoors. Despite my disguise of a British accent, I'm actually based here at our headquarters in Chicago. So right now that percentage is closer to 100% because we have drastic temperatures outside and quite a lot of snow on its way towards us. But typically that's 90% of our time that we're spending in an indoor environment. Whether it's in education, in a work context, we're typically spending a significant amount of that time indoors, sharing that space with other people. So there's this human-to-human impact when it comes to some of these issues as well. And then it comes as no surprise, it's the most obvious statement I'll make in the whole webinar today: we'll breathe. It's something that we really can't avoid. And let's think about this daily breath intake in comparison with some of the things that we're regularly consuming. So typically speaking, we should be drinking around 2.5 cups of water on a daily basis. Just under 5 pounds of food on a daily basis should be our target consumption. From a perspective of breathing, we're breathing completely subconsciously 3,000 gallons of air every single day. And I guarantee that if the cup of water that's maybe sat in front of you right now on your desk, like me, if that water was dirty, you would just refuse to drink it. If the food was dirty, you would refuse to eat it. But we're probably not paying too much attention to how dirty that air is because, quite frankly, it's an invisible issue that's so easy for us to ignore and so easy for the people around us to ignore as well. So what really is the impact of allergies and asthma? And within this, we're going to touch on a few different topics. Obviously, there's a physical impact, also a fiscal impact, financially, productivity-wise. There are a number of factors that we're going to touch on in this section right now. So first of all, we've talked about this impact of us spending 90% of our time indoors and so many hours sharing air with other people. Well, according to the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, typically indoor air can be up to 2 to 5 times more polluted than outdoor air. And one of the reasons for this is actually in the way that we construct our buildings and construct our homes. The major focus is on energy efficiency and keeping that indoor air in and the outdoor air out from a heating and primarily from a heating and energy efficiency perspective. The impact of this is versus our homes 50 or 100 years ago, our homes don't breathe for us anymore. So the way that we get our homes and our buildings to breathe is via forced mechanical means, which then becomes dependent on the upkeep of that equipment and also in the quality of the whole installation and maintenance of that equipment as well. So indoor air making its way, outdoor air making its way in is something we want to avoid, but also the impact of that indoor air becoming stale because of a lack of air change or a lack of control of the quality of that air. And then really allergies and asthma also really appear on the top offenders list when it comes to being serious conditions and serious illnesses for people here in the United States. So allergies is seen as the 6th leading cause of chronic illness in the US, and work-related asthma is a prevalent, well accepted occupational lung disease. So these aren't just inconveniences, especially for people who truly suffer from these issues. This is really an impact on quality of life, an impact on health. In some instances, these things can be fatal as well. So these are really things that need to be taken seriously, and more so are being taken seriously in multiple environments. Obviously, there's always some big numbers that can be published around the impact of these issues. So each year in the US, these are some of the estimates of the impact of allergies and asthma. 16 million school absences, 16 million days where children are not able to learn. They're actually missing school because of allergies and asthma. And that doesn't account for the days where they're not at their optimum. They're not able to concentrate. They're not able to absorb all that information, but maybe they're in school. Maybe they're present. They have that tick. They're there in the classroom, but are they able to perform at their optimum because of these issues that they're suffering from, these illnesses? You translate this into a work environment. We see around just over 14 million lost work days on an annual basis in the United States because of this, and how all this feeds into the impact on sick days and lost productivity. Well, here in the US, that's $5.1 billion every single year as a cost to our economy because of sick days and lost productivity. So obviously, this all trickles down into whatever environment you're joining the webinar today from. But there's an obvious physical health impact, but also a fiscal and financial impact to these issues as well. Some of the considerations when we think about one application area, this is education environments. Actually, the EPA estimates that around half of the nation's schools have some form of an air quality problem, and there's three main factors to this. One is that typically the schools that you get more schools in densely populated areas where we're using more and more cars on our roads, and also other road traffic as well. So there's an outdoor pollution issue that's making its way into these environments. Often we have this desire, and it's the right thing to do, to keep our environments clean and hygienic. But sometimes the substances that we're using to achieve this are very questionable. And one topic that we actually run a whole separate program on is a focus on green cleaning. And there's a lot to be said for thinking about the selection of the right substances and materials and processes to use when it comes to upkeep in our facilities. And then finally, one factor is typically it's not uncommon for school environments and education environments across the whole spectrum to be older facilities as well, and that obviously has an impact on whether they actually have any sort of ventilation system or the quality of that ventilation system if it's a slightly older facility as well. So what's the triggers? What are the things in the air that really start to impact people who suffer from allergies and asthma in our environments? Well, typically we talk about 4 primary drivers that can make indoor air go bad. And some of these are due to substances making their way in the building through human activity. Some are through the building materials themselves. Obviously, there's human-to-human interaction, but then also the things that we use to run our facilities on a daily basis as well. So first of all, we talk about bacteria and viruses. It's really unavoidable to prevent these things from entering our facilities. Obviously, the human-to-human impact is significant as far as bacteria and viruses are concerned, but there are things that we can do, such as cleaning, such as a focus on surface hygiene and hand hygiene, as a way of trying to reduce people's exposure to some of these issues, especially when we start to talk about the more vulnerable age groups, whether that's the really young, the really old, or the people who are in a medical or healthcare environment as well. So our belief is that there's a triangle approach to this. Surface hygiene is critical, hand hygiene is critical, but we also believe that air hygiene is something that it needs to be considered as part of a 3-pronged attack. The second one along is obviously a big focus as to what we're talking about today, those triggers that affect people with allergies and asthma. The spectrum is huge, and the common misconception is that this is just a seasonal issue. This is just something that comes and goes from April time and disappears around July time. The reality is and we'll look into this in a little bit more detail, is that that's just simply not the case, especially for people who are suffering more so in the winter months at this time of year. The third thing on here, VOCs, volatile organic compounds, substances that are in a gaseous form when at room temperature. There are tens of thousands of these substances, and actually hundreds of new substances being discovered on a daily basis. We'll go into a little bit more detail about some of the symptoms and the impacts of these issues and the types of things where VOCs are going to be found in. And then finally, the fourth thing on here, odors, the most common complaint when it comes to an air quality issue within a facility, but often linked to a much more serious issue. So obviously there are sources of odor in our facilities, but sometimes this can be linked to other issues such as a mold concern or a humidity concern, or other issues like that as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to dive into some of these topics in a little bit more detail. And the first one we're going to explore, due to the nature of today's focus of the webinar, is around allergy and asthma, dust mites. So this is something that really is going to be just as prevalent during the non-pollen months as it will be in the pollen months. And oftentimes people are more so impacted at this time of year, when typically we're spending more time indoors. We're less likely to have open windows and open doors because of temperature control and energy efficiency. And dust mites are typically very closely linked, one of the real bridges between people who suffer from allergies and people who suffer from asthma. So it affects people, around a quarter of people with allergic diseases, and around 50 all the way up to 80% of asthma cases, depending on which part of the US you look at, are linked to dust mites and dust mite feces being a common trigger. So one of the most obvious things, one of the real all year round triggers that we can pay attention to, but really one of the things that is quite easy to deal with through a few simple approaches. I already touched on this a second ago. Some of the substances, some of the triggers and allergens that are seasonal, so tree pollen typically will start to appear in our air from springtime through to the end of summer. Grass pollen just in the summertime. Weed pollen starts to creep into the fall period. Outdoor mold, especially because of the more humid months, is covering 3/4 of the year. But the bottom half of this table that we're looking at on screen right now are some of the issues that we see across all months of the year. So indoor mold, dust mites, which we've just touched on, pet dander, especially in a household environment, cockroaches, all sorts of triggers for people who suffer from allergies that are going to be detected in air within facilities all year round. So things that really help us question and challenge this concept of allergies just being something that's seasonal and just something that affects 3 or 4 months of the year. And there are some other factors that are contributing to the rising amount of people suffering from some form of an allergy. So the first of these 3 things that we've got on the screen here, one of which is climate change, and we're actually seeing that this climate change impact is leading to more allergen-producing plants growing faster and having longer seasons within the year. So that chart that we just looked at starts to get even more impactful. Increasing levels of ozone and CO2 are feeding allergy-reducing plants. So these are issues on the rise. And certain substances are becoming more allergenic when they're in certain gases in the air. So one example here is ragweed pollen actually becomes more allergenic when carbon dioxide levels are being increased. So obviously, one of the most obvious things that facilities are focusing on, especially when you come to look at building regulations and ASHRAE code, is CO2 levels. And there's a huge amount of research that's been done to really prove that there are productivity gains and concentration improvements when it comes to reducing levels of carbon dioxide within educational environments. In particular, there's a couple of really interesting Harvard studies that I'd recommend taking a look at. But with increased levels of carbon dioxide, it's not just the direct impact of that, but also the impact it has on other substances within the air. So ragweed pollen is one of those substances that is directly impacted by those increases in CO2. And obviously, in those peak months that we were looking at a short while ago, primarily the springtime is when most of the triggers, the outdoor related triggers, are being impacted. People often think if we're indoors, then we're safe, we're away from those things. Obviously, there's some air exchange going on between indoor air and outdoor air, so you're heavily reliant on the filtration and the ability for that filtration within a total building air management system to be able to take out some of those substances from the air. But then there's also the human interaction that brings some of these things in. These things get attached to people's clothes, to people's hair, to people's luggage, and laptop bags or school bags, whatever it may be, and these things easily become airborne again as they enter into a facility. And people with serious allergic conditions, it doesn't take much for a trigger to happen and for a reaction to take place. One of the things that is becoming more and more understood in certain parts of the world and taken more and more seriously is air pollution. But this isn't just about trying to take things out of the air that are going to improve our overall health. There's a crossover between heightened air pollution concerns, PM 2.5, PM 10. Ultimately, these are substances in the air that can also be linked to people's allergic reactions as well. So typically speaking, the World Health Organization recommends a target level of 10 when it comes to PM 2.5. So that's 10 micrograms per cubic meter of particles that are 2.5 microns or smaller. You can see from the visual that we're looking at on screen here across the United States, especially in the city hub, more built up environments, we see a lot of darker yellow into the orange, eventually into the red in some areas where we're almost double or even higher in some instances of the target World Health Organization levels of PM 2.5. So this is also affecting people who suffer from allergies and asthma if they are living in a city environment, in a built-up environment. There's a direct link between their suffering and these levels of outdoor air pollution as well. So when it comes to that broad spectrum of issues that can make indoor air go bad, the one that was over on the right-hand side of the screen previously was odors. The most common detectable, easy to complain about issue when it comes to air quality within an indoor environment. So often the approach, especially in restroom and bathroom environments, the approach to deal with odors is to use other odors and fragrances to mask the issue, which is fine as a way of trying to create the perception of the problem being removed. The reality is that these masking solutions are not removing the issue. They're doing exactly what I described it as earlier. They're masking the issue. The other risk as well is that these substances often add even more contamination into the air. They're adding there's propellants which come with health concerns, and also VOCs that are used to actually create the fragrance itself, that are all being thrown into the air every 10 minutes or 15 minutes when a burst of fragrance takes place. So not only are you not getting to the root of the issue, you're not actually creating a more hygienic environment by using these approaches, but you're also actually adding in more potential allergy triggers and asthma triggers into the air for people who suffer from those illnesses as well. So VOCs, I talked about this a second ago, volatile organic compounds. There are over 11,000 of these substances that are identified in very common products that we use in our homes and in our commercial and shared environments on a daily basis. So the types of things that this can lead to, people will suffer from headaches, fatigue. It's closely linked to the topic of today's webinar of asthma and allergic reactions as well. But the real issue here is people will very rarely, and I would argue will never, turn around and say, I'm suffering from a headache today, or I think my asthma's not helping me very much today because of increased levels of volatile organic compounds within this work environment. They're probably going to put it down to staring at a screen for too long, or it being a high pollen count day, or maybe just being a little bit tired. So these are issues that us on the webinar today is people who are really the wellness caregiver, the wellness caretaker of these environments. I've got to take responsibility for and try and reduce some of these issues. And the type of products that are contributing towards these increased levels of VOCs are simple things like paints, flooring, flat pack furniture, and other types of furniture that we use in our environment, printers, cleaning products, as I mentioned, those fragrance solutions. So obviously one of the approaches is to really consider your approach to green cleaning and consider reviewing some of the substances that you're using to upkeep your facility, but also maybe considering things that can help reduce levels of VOCs within the air in environments where that is really going to be most beneficial for your building occupant. So how do we measure the benefit? How do we measure some sort of return on our investment when it comes to trying to improve indoor air quality and reduce some of these triggers from the air? Well, there are a huge amount of studies and case studies and testimonials, not just from us as a brand, but from many approaches to improve indoor air quality that are linked to these 5 things that we're looking at on screen right now. So first of which is improvements to productivity. And I touched on briefly those Harvard studies that have taken place, and there's more work being done right now on this topic. There's also a couple of really interesting studies from Europe on this topic as well, where they've really looked at students' abilities and workers within a work environment's abilities to carry out a number of different tasks, whether that's simple processes, whether it's retain information, whether it's think creatively, think strategically, use their initiative. And not all of those types of processes, but some of the more challenging topics, they're directly impacted and worsened in terms of the time it takes and the quality of the output with worse air quality conditions. So that's certainly something to bear in mind. Reduced levels of absenteeism. So obviously productivity is a discussion really about presenteeism. How do we make sure people are performing at their best and can really make magic happen when they're in an education environment or a work environment? But then the most obvious measure is the absenteeism as well. So we want as many people in the workplace as possible or in an education environment as we possibly can do. The third one is covers a multitude of facility types, but especially a public environment where you've got some sort of customer reaction, especially a paying customer perception. Taking a proactive approach to improve indoor air quality can be really closely linked to improved facility perceptions, especially if you're taking out some of the obvious things like odors and if it's an environment that enables people who suffer from these conditions to really thrive and have an improved quality of life whilst they're spending time in your facility, there's really a lot to be said for that. Facility perceptions closely links to the fourth one on here, the reduction of complaints, especially when it comes to odors, which is a really common complaint when it comes to indoor air quality. And then ultimately, this is an approach that's not right for everyone, but if you're involved in the type of facility that wants to create an environment that's all about having a place where people can come to be at their best, which is really what a lot of people who work in this type of field are really driving towards and striving towards. So if you're really about trying to create a positive, more health-focused environment, then air quality is one of the factors that need to be taken seriously. So one of the big stats from one of these studies that I mentioned on that previous slide was the cognitive assessment. So they were actually looking at the people's ability to retain information and carry out certain tasks, and they actually saw up to 61% higher scores, higher performance in cognitive assessments when this was being measured as a comparison between standard air quality conditions and improved air quality conditions. So these were controlled environments where a number of air quality indicators were being taken into consideration, and there's really significant improvements that were being seen here, over up to 61% in some instances. And we talked a little bit about some of the big numbers of the billions of dollars and the millions of days that are lost because of some of these issues. Well, let's try and translate this right down to the cost of one person taking sick leave on an annual basis within your environment. The average cost of this is just over $2,500 here in the United States. So anything that can contribute towards reducing absenteeism, but also making people at their best whilst they're in your facility, is something that I'm sure most financial controllers would be very interested to hear about. And I said right at the top of the webinar that as well as the focus on allergy and asthma, we're going to touch on a few different topics when it comes to indoor air quality. So one that's really dominating the press right now, as far as an air-related issue, is the influenza. And often people believe as long as we keep our surfaces clean and keep washing our hands and use alcohol gels, then we'll be ready. And obviously they are key approaches to maintaining a high standard of hygiene. But the CDC actually will quoted to say that air is the most common transfer of the influenza virus. It's the most common way for that to be transferred from person to person. And obviously one of the common approaches which we all hear about and many of us do is to take the flu shot. Well, last flu season, so we're talking about the 2016-2017 flu season, there are 4 options here. How effective was the flu shot in preventing the contraction of the flu virus? Well, maybe some of you are fully aware of this, but I'm sure some of you will be surprised to learn that it was actually 19%, so the lowest of the figures that we see on screen here. So even something as promoted as this is really not going to be the single thing that we can do to prevent contracting diseases and illnesses like the flu. And there's a direct impact as far as productivity and costs to our businesses and facilities on an annual basis as well. So obviously there's fatalities linked to this, a number of hospitalizations, lost productivity due to work days, lost productivity and education opportunities because of missed school days as well. So just like allergy and asthma, this is something else that is really having a major impact on our physical health and financial health as well as organizations. So the idea here of talking about this is something that can be removed from the air through a good proactive approach to improved air quality. So we just wanted to touch on some of the other issues that can be dealt with as part of this same approach. And the reason this closely links to allergy and asthma at the same time, but this image is really focused on the spread of influenza, is it's the small, more infectious droplets or particulates that remain airborne for a much longer period of time and are therefore able to travel a much longer distance. And this applies directly to allergic triggers that we find within our indoor air environment, such as the dust mite feces, the pollens. The smaller the particle, the more likely they are to remain airborne for a longer period of time and to spread further within an indoor air environment. And actually, people often think that our inbuilt air management system, our HVAC system, is there to deal with some of these issues. Well, actually, sometimes these can accelerate the spread of these airborne issues. And ultimately, the filtration within these systems is not in there for the benefit of the occupant primarily. It's in there to help really with the maintenance of the machinery and the maintenance of the equipment that's used within that environment. And this is a really obvious statement, but people's first impression of an environment really sticks for a long time. It's really hard to change that. So anything that can be done to improve a customer or employee's perception or a student's perception can really benefit the impression that they have of that environment. So one of the most obvious areas when it comes to trying to improve air, especially when it comes to odors, but often quite active areas when it comes to indoor air quality issues as well, primarily because of odor issues, hygiene concerns, the amount of occupants that use these types of environments within a facility, and then some of those fragrance concerns that I touched on earlier as well. This is a common area where you have a constant concern when it comes to airborne contamination. So some comments here with regards to education users and perception of an environment. People really shape their perceptions around what they see in a bathroom environment, and we can easily translate this to even our own social interactions or when you spend time in a restaurant or in any public environment, is it really does say a lot about an organization, says a lot about a company's approach to hygiene when you see their bathroom environment. So people will typically avoid being a repeat customer to an environment. And the example here is around 60% of students would avoid a restroom even if they needed to use the facility if their perception was poor. This translates into all types of environments. So just one area within a facility where we can not only reduce people's exposure to some of these asthmatic and allergic triggers, but where we can also benefit from other improvements from an improved air quality perspective. And then, there are 3 primary complaints that we can link to this approach as well. Typically, a facilities person doesn't receive many phone calls saying, I really appreciate that. There's no smell in the bathroom today. My asthma is not playing up, and all my light bulbs are working perfectly well. Thank you very much. It's normally the opposite. It's people complaining because they're suffering, or they see an issue, or their perception is poor. So odors is the most common complaint, but people who do suffer from allergies will be very aware, especially if it's an environment that they spend a number of hours there on a daily basis and many days there on a weekly basis. They will know exactly where their allergies and asthmatic conditions are the worst. So those people are certainly people that I would recommend speaking to within your environment when it comes to trying to take a proactive approach to improve the environment for asthmatic and allergic sufferers. And this really wraps up that whole point around that triangle approach of 3 primary factors. So obviously surface hygiene is key and continues to be taken very seriously. Hand hygiene, which is an extension of our hard surfaces. But the thing that we think is often ignored the most is air quality. So our belief is that for a truly clean facility, the air quality has got to be considered as part of the overall holistic cleaning approach. So the final section before we wrap up and take some of the questions that we've been receiving during the webinar is what is the approach that we can take to effectively clean the air? Well, first of all, which we've touched on, is this idea of green cleaning. Really think about some of the substances that you're using, especially when it comes to chemicals, that can be negatively impacting the air quality within your environment. So anything that has high content of VOCs should really be reconsidered. Also, the other approaches to cleaning can also impact people with allergy and asthma. So just simply the time of day that vacuuming takes place. Vacuuming is a really has a significant impact on airborne triggers for people with asthma and allergies. So that being done at the end of a day versus at the start of a day can really have a significant impact on people who suffer from allergic conditions. And then also the broader materials used within an environment that can also impact indoor air quality. So this links with some of those VOCs that we talked about a second ago. We touched on this idea of HVAC, or an air handling unit, or total building air management system. People will often say, well, we have that in place as a way of improving air quality and taking some of these things out of the air. Ultimately, a HVAC system is designed to do exactly how the term is described: heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. It's really there for temperature control, outdoor air exchange with indoor air, and it's really not there to clean the air. And when we look at typical grades of filtration used in these systems, they're going to deal with a small amount of particles at the small micron sizes. They're really not there to focus on taking some of these triggers out of the air that we've talked about on today's webinar. And obviously, those systems are really designed to cater for the total facility environment. Our belief for an approach, and this is where we start to link it back to our specific approach to improved indoor air quality, is invest in something that's going to have the maximum impact in the place where you need it the most. So don't try and take out all these things from the air in every cubic foot of your facility, but really focus on spot purification, where it's going to have the most impact and the most ultimately the most health benefits and the most financial benefits to you as an organization. So our focus really as an organization with AeraMax Professional is to remove rather than redistribute the issue that's within the air. And one of the ways that we've tried to bring this to life, and this isn't specific to our solution, but just any in-room system, is that really position it in the environment where it's going to be needed the most. So the scenario that we see on the left-hand side is a 6 cubicle restroom environment with all 6 toilets flushing at the same time, with just standard air change taking place in the room. So you have an inlet and an outlet with air quality, with air exchange, and then some air making its way into the room from underneath the door as well. So this is a typical air exchange code for this type of environment. So this is probably very similar to what you may have within your facility. And what we've got freeze framed here on the slide is the high concentration contamination within the air. So this is just showing the 2.5 parts per million airborne contamination with all those 6 toilets flushing at the same time. So what you can see is this high concentration contamination is at breathing height. It's actually making its way over the cubicle doors in a lot of environments. And this is just the high concentration spread. Now, when we introduce a purification solution into this environment, what we see is a dramatic decrease in just the amount of red that's visible on the screen here, but also the way that high concentration contamination is controlled to be very, very, very close to the original source of the contamination. Obviously, the best possible approach is to remove the source, but we're talking about a bathroom in a public or shared air environment. That's not a question. There's really no option to remove the source, to remove the toilet from that environment. So what we can do here is really control and reduce the human exposure to some of these contamination issues within the air. Now, one of the benefits of AeraMax Professional is that this is a integrated wall-mounted solution, so you can really control the positioning of that for optimum performance, for ADA compliance, but also for the benefit of it being out of the way of public or employee interaction as well. And the types of environments, obviously, this isn't just about dealing with the restrooms or the bathrooms. This is very applicable for waiting areas, for classroom environments, for dining and cafeteria environments. Obviously, bathrooms and restrooms we've touched on, highly populated office spaces, meeting rooms, conference rooms, locker rooms, fitness facilities, spin studios. We've really got these units installed in a huge spectrum of application areas here in the United States and on a global level as well. So anywhere that can benefit from improved indoor air quality is going to benefit from a system like this. If we think about the way that we approach improved air quality, this is really a commercial solution. Because of our use of HEPA filtration, we're able to remove 99.9% and in a lot of cases over 99.9% of allergens and viruses from the air. We have H1N1 certification for 99.99% removal within a time frame of 35 minutes. Significant reduction in odors and VOCs thanks to active carbon filtration. Real automatic set it and forget it technology. So we use a combination of air quality sensor, motion sensor, and sound sensor. So the unit works harder when the air is bad, but also can work harder depending on the level of occupancy within an environment as well. So that's all thanks to the EnviroSmart technology that we built into our systems. We have 3 units that cover from 300 to 1400 square feet, depending on the number of air changes needed. And typically we tend to focus on 5 air changes an hour within those spaces that we're able to cover with these systems. I've touched briefly on the filtration process, but just to call out the multiple steps to that filtration process. The first thing we use is a pre-filter, which is all about large particles and prolonging the life of the other filters. Then we go into carbon filtration, active carbon filtration, which is all around removing odors and VOCs without the use of chemicals or without the use of masking. And HEPA filtration, which is all about that 99.97% claim of 0.3 micron removal. And that filter is also treated with an antimicrobial treatment, which means that anything caught on that filter won't grow further or fester. And then finally, we have a supplementary bipolar ionizer in the system, which is there to ultimately break down substances at a molecular level within the indoor air environment as well. So 3 units, as I mentioned, covering from 300 square feet all the way up to 1400 square feet, no chemicals, super energy efficient, and really designed for 24/7 constant air cleaning within a shared air commercial environment. So ultimately trying to improve the environment for asthma and allergy sufferers, but also broader benefits to improve their quality within your environment as well. So with that being said, we are nicely on time to allow for some questions and answers before we wrap up at the top of the hour. So I'd just like to say before we pass back over and hear some of those questions, a real thank you from AeraMax Professional for taking the time to join today's webinar. As we heard right at the start, if you'd like a copy of the content, then please do flag that within the Q&A panel. And you can also get a lot of information on our website, which you see on the bottom there, which is aeramaxpro.com. So with that being said, let's hand back over and hear if we have any questions that we can answer.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Thanks for that presentation and to our attendees as well. Yes, we do have some questions, so we'll jump right in. One of them is regarding the placement of products. You had touched on products at the end, so I'll touch on that first. In terms of placement, okay, so one of the questions is I have an open office, and so what kind of placement would you advise? What kind of experience do you have with that in terms of how far apart are they placed? You know, kind of, do you need several clustered together, or how does that work in an open office setting?
Sure. So, I mean, ultimately, it really depends on the size of the space that we're talking about. So, normally we're going to be into the thousands or even tens of thousands of square feet of space. So, as long as we're talking about relatively standard ceiling heights, then you can really take those numbers that I had on the screen a second ago. So up to 1400 square feet, and then you would just divide the total space by 1400, and that's going to give you an idea of the number of units. So basically, it's if you imagine how you would try and light an environment or heat an environment, it's all about having good coverage so that gradient effect takes place. So obviously, the closer somebody is to the system, they're going to benefit the most from that improved air quality. But as long as the coverage and they're spaced out well, then the total environment is going to be well controlled. One of the benefits of air is that it's one of the good things and the bad things about air is that it's pretty lazy. It will always take the easiest route and can be quite easily influenced, especially in an indoor environment. So you know, our typical advice is just space them out well and make sure you've got enough units in an open environment to cover the total number of square footage, and you'll be in good shape.
Thank you. And to the asthma and allergy topic, you had mentioned that your products are certified asthma and allergy friendly by the AAFA.
Yep.
Can you just elaborate on what kind of what that means in terms of what type of testing the products went through, or what kind of features did the foundation recognize to provide that to you?
Sure. So one of the things that they look for is, first of all, they take a real strong look at the documentation that we have on file. So we have through third-party laboratories, we get accredited testing on our filtration media, for example, on our finished filters, on our total finished machine. And so first of all, they review a lot of that data and just verify that that's accurate and fair. But then they also work with a laboratory in Ireland where they do a number of tests themselves on certain substances. So, for example, one of the things that they typically focus on is pet allergens, because it's an easy one for them to test within an environment, and it's very representative of a broad spectrum of particle sizes as well. So they will actually do their own testing to validate that the machine is able to reduce levels of those substances within an indoor environment over a specific period of time. So it's ultimately a combination of secondary secondary reviews of our existing documentation, but then also some first-hand testing that they carry out themselves. So it's quite a lengthy process to do that, and then they do some spot testing on an ongoing basis to continue to validate that as well.
Thank you. Thank you. And I actually want to touch on something you mentioned about the VOC filtration, and this is having to do more with VOCs around printers that we've heard about in the industry. VOCs being given off by printers that might be in offices and obviously other settings. So, does your product address this type of VOCs? And have you had any installations in terms of printer rooms where there's a cluster of printers? I mean, have you gotten into that scenario at all?
Yeah, within education environments and some office environments, we've done. I don't know if the term is understood here, but we typically refer to those as like repro rooms or reprographic rooms, where that you've normally got a number of printers in that environment. You get a real strong smell. I always remember school when you go into those rooms and you get that real strong smell when you go into that environment. But typically, you've got people who'll be in that environment for a number of hours on a daily basis. So yeah, we've done installs in those environments, and you've got a combination of physical particulates that are going to be in those environments because of a lot of use of paper. But yeah, basically any type of VOC can be dealt with in some way, shape, or form with an active carbon filter. So we actually have, and this is something I'd be happy to share if anyone's interested in seeing a copy, is we have a grading system which shows, I think there's about 300 to 400 substances, VOC substances on this form, and it rates standard active carbon's effectiveness against reducing levels of those substances from the air. And it's a grading of 1 through 4. And most commonly, the factors that we're dealing with in a printer environment or a reprographics environment rate a 3 or a 4. So active carbon is seen as a highly effective way at taking some of those issues out of the air. And the real benefit of course, of active carbon as an approach is you're adsorbing those substances out of the air. So adsorption with a D versus absorption with a B is really the process of capturing something in a way which means it cannot be released. Whereas a sponge which absorbs water, you can just squeeze that back out again. But once these substances are in the carbon, they're not going to be released again. They're going to be locked in there until that filter is removed.
Thank you. And let's see, we have one last question, and this, while you're on the topic of filtration, actually, you had shown that slide with the several different filters. So just wanted to ask you about those filters in terms of maintenance. If someone does install this or install the product or multiple products, obviously, throughout the facility, and there is another maintenance demand, so to speak, and of course want to make sure that these are working at full capacity. So what types of maintenance is required for the filtration, for the filters, and are there any alerts or anything like that on the machine that will alert the staff to keep up with that?
Sure. Yeah, so so the two primary filters that we have in the unit are the carbon filter and the HEPA filter. So typically the carbon filter is every 6 months, and then whenever you change that carbon filter, you're going to change the pre-filter at the same time. And then the HEPA filter is once a year. So it's nice and simple. It's not so frequent that it becomes a real headache, but it's frequent enough that the unit can continue to perform at its optimum. So there's really it's kind of two directions with the filter changes. So the carbon is something that has a lifespan because of the adsorption technique. Once it's at capacity, then it just stops being effective. The HEPA filter is kind of strange in the way that once a HEPA filter is a day old or 2 days old, it becomes more and more effective as time goes on. But the issue is, as it becomes more and more clogged, it actually is able to move less air. So a filter that's been in use for a year is actually the best possible filter you could be using, but it just reduces its airflow to the point where it stops being able to cater for that amount of space. So yeah, 6 months for a carbon and once a year for the HEPA filter. And then the unit will smartly indicate when the filter is at 90%, both of those individual filters, when they're at 90% of their lifespan, and then when they're at 100% of their lifespan, just to give you an early indicator and then a final indicator that it's time to change those filters out.
And actually, one more question. And Mike, could we see that slide that had, it was about 2 slides back maybe, that had the filters shown, since we were describing those? Yes, right there. And I actually had a follow-on question, and then we will close out. And I thank everyone for the questions. In terms of the allergies and asthma that you had talked about today, is there a specific type of filter here that addresses that, or is it more of a combination, or what, I guess, what technology is addressing the asthma and allergies is my question.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Thank you. So if we look at the total spectrum of triggers for people with allergy and asthma, especially respiratory allergies, then typically it's a physical substance, a physical particulate within the air that's going to be the primary trigger. So the real workhorse in our filtration process to benefit those people is the HEPA filter, because of the ability to take out 99.97% of those particles down to the size of 0.3 microns. And just to put that size into perspective, if you take a hair off your head, the diameter of that hair is going to be around 70 to 80 microns, so 70 to 80 microns. So when we talk 0.3, these are the things that you absolutely cannot see with the human eye. The human eye normally stops being able to see those things at 15 to 20 microns in size. So those real fine particles that get into your respiratory system and even into your blood flow are the things that are triggering the majority of those issues. But then obviously you have people who are hypersensitive to certain chemicals in the air. So that's when the use of a carbon filter at the same time becomes a benefit. So holistically, the total approach of our 4-step process is pretty solid here. It's very well accepted, very well understood in the marketplace, carbon and HEPA filtration. But the real workhorse is the filter that's taking out those physical substances, so the HEPA filter.
Well, thank you. Thank you for touching on that. So I will, it looks like we are out of time, so I want to thank you, Mike, for the presentation. It is a lot of good information.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And I'd also like to thank AeraMax Professional for sponsoring this event, and of course to our audience for attending today and participating. A recording of this webinar will be available online at our website, and that's facilityexecutive.com, as well as at the AeraMax Professional website, and that's aeramaxpro.com. So thank you again, everyone, and have a great afternoon.